Breaking news: Putin's sanctions-busters play into Western determination. In order to keep the pressure on Russia and its oil price cap, the United States and Europe need to step up their efforts. Russian oil export prices have been capped at $60 per barrel for the last year by the U.S. and its group of 7 allies, who have also banned Western-based traders from selling Russian crude at prices higher than $60 per barrel. The goal was to prevent a spike in energy prices around the world while reducing President Vladimir Putin's capacity to fund his war in Ukraine. At least initially, the strategy accomplished its goal of cutting off tens of billions of dollars in income to the Kremlin. Russia has developed a more efficient method to evade sanctions and keep selling oil to developing nations at prices higher than the $60 per barrel limit, according to a Bloomberg News investigation and documentary that go hand in hand. In order to keep Putin in check, Western governments will need to take a harder stance. As he drinks coffee on a Verona terrace and listens to the bells of a neighboring medieval church, billionaire Igor Makarov narrates his life as a prisoner of Western sanctions. He has put his ambitions to expand his energy companies on hold and most of the money he made doing business in the USSR and Russia on ice. He boarded a commercial flight from Cyprus to Italy on budget carrier EasyJet since his yacht and 2 private jets were impounded. I want to know, why are these sanctions being applied to me? To what end do they work? In a rare interview, Makarov said, they don't help Ukraine, while blinking in the Italian sunshine. Scores of billionaires have been sanctioned by Western governments in an effort to demonize Russian President Vladimir Putin, cut off funding for his war, and ultimately turn him against him. Unless they demonstrate a change in behavior, the tycoons should feel the consequences of doing business with Putin, according to Peter Stano, the European Commission's Foreign Affairs spokesperson. Enable the proceeds to flow to Ukraine. The White House also announced in April 2022 a plan to seize the assets of the targeted tycoons under certain circumstances. Despite this, just $5.4 million, out of an estimated $58 billion in frozen private assets, has made its way to Kiev in the 21 months following the sanctions, and very few of the sanctioned businessmen have spoken out against Putin. The sanction procedure is being criticized by some of the rich businessmen as being unfair, opaque, and unlawful, and they are now battling back in court. Although the sanctions have imposed hardship on the tycoons, it's not in the short term benefiting Ukraine, according to Nigel Gould-Davies, a former British ambassador to Belarus and senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Experts and ex-diplomats are wondering how to make sanctions work better and provide financial aid to Kiev as worries about Western support for Ukraine mount on a more specific plan to remove tycoons from sanctions lists in return for money, and denouncing Putin is one possible alternative, according to these people. The idea is divisive in Western governments, which are reluctant to imply that wealthy individuals can manipulate lists to their advantage. Also, Ukraine isn't on board with sanctions relief. The rich and Putin has taken advantage of Russia's elites while in power to pay for his pet projects and government funding shortfalls. In order to bolster their support on the day of the invasion, he called for some of them to meet at the Kremlin. He went on to accuse affluent Russians who harbor pro-Western sentiments and steal their money as traitors later in his speech, according to Tom Kietinge, director of the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute in London. The West sees the invasion as a golden opportunity to crack down on what it perceives as the proceeds of corruption in Russia's wealth. Congress engaged in emotional sanctioning in an effort to punish Putin for the invasion. According to Fiona Hill, a former senior official at the U.S. National Security Council. According to Hill, though, punishment without a goal is useless. A useless workout. Everyone from high-ranking officials like Putin and so-called oligarchs to low-ranking regional officials with few overseas assets to 61-year-old tycoon Makarov is a target of the personal asset freezes. During Turkmenistan's time as a Soviet republic, Makarov was born in the early 1990s. He established a natural gas company. Canada accuses him of profiting from his ties to senior Russian government officials to facilitate energy deals that brought in funds that the Kremlin utilized to lay the groundwork for its invasion of Ukraine, while the United Kingdom accuses him of being involved in Russia's energy sector. Russian government officials coerced Makarov into selling his company to Rosneft, a Russian energy giant, for a pittance in 2013, and since then, he has avoided doing business in Russia, he claims. denying any wrongdoing. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United Kingdom have all placed freezes on over $1.6 billion, or nearly 90% of his assets. Each Western government makes its own decision regarding the sanctioning of tycoons according to its own set of legal, economic, and geopolitical considerations. Makarov is able to maintain his lavish lifestyle in Dubai, Cyprus, and Italy despite not being sanctioned by the US or EU. According to him, his family has been hit the hardest by the sanctions, as he is unable to access money in a family trust and several of his daughter's bank accounts have been frozen. To get the sanctions lifted, Makarov renounced his Russian citizenship this year. However, he has not explicitly denounced Putin. He deemed that endeavor to be pointless due to the president's widespread support within the country. This tragedy in Ukraine is something I am very worried about, but I am unrelated to it, he stated. Nowhere in the world am I in favor of war. Knowing full well the dangers involved, few tycoons have made public statements denouncing the war. Some have families still living in Russia, and they are aware that the Kremlin can strike back at its enemies anywhere in the world. After entrepreneur and banker Oleg Tinkov renounced his Russian citizenship, denounced the invasion, and called Putin a fascist, the United Kingdom lifted sanctions against him in July. The head of Yandex, Russia's version of Google, Arkady Volas, condemned the war as barbaric but was nevertheless subject to EU sanctions. An outlined method. Some have argued that the sanctions are just a public relations stunt that will not result in any real change in Russia because of the way they are being applied. Authorities in the West, both current and past, hold different opinions. Some, like Hill, refer to them as a toolbox. Sanctions are not decisive in and of themselves, but they do put pressure on Putin and the whole system, according to Ambassador Daniel Fried, who oversaw the U.S. State Department's response to Russia's 2014 illegal annexation of Crimea. You can't possibly imagine Russia being vanquished and pushed out of Ukrainian territory in the next 15 months, Gul Davies chimed in. In 1.5 years, how likely is it that sanctions will lead to the collapse of the Russian regime? The problem for Western countries trying to send money to Ukraine is that sanctions often make it impossible to sell assets unless they are directly tied to criminal activity. Most wealthy people have not been charged with any illegal activity, and it can take a long time to prove that. This year's new laws let the U.S. to transfer frozen assets to Ukraine, but they belong to a tycoon who was first sanctioned for his role in the annexation of Crimea. The possibility of seizing more than $300 billion worth of Russian state assets is being considered by Western countries as well. Failure, delete, and contribute. Some experts have suggested that governments explore alternative approaches due to the complexity of seizing assets to assist Ukraine. One possibility is to set up a system whereby wealthy Russians could essentially defect to the West, denounce the war, and give Ukraine a large portion of their wealth. Tycoons could donate frozen funds for Ukraine's reconstruction, according to a plan announced by Britain in June. People were hesitant to get involved, maybe because the Foreign Office had already stated that sanctions would not be lifted in exchange. However, if wealthy individuals were to donate and publicly criticize Putin, the office might reconsider its stance. According to Keatinge, the UK Foreign Office and its Sanctions Office have discussed the possibility of a donation, implying that a new chapter is around the corner, even though Western officials insist they will never let tycoons buy their way off the list. Ukrainian officials are opposed to lifting sanctions on wealthy individuals and would only consider such a move if a very serious part of their assets are transferred for reconstruction, according to a sanctions advisor in President Volodymyr Zelensky's office. Speaking on the condition of anonymity, the advisor, who was not authorized to speak publicly, said that Ukraine would also desire a very clear and public statement about Putin and the war. If you can get more than that, it would be a good outcome, Keatinge said, adding that a tycoon should also have to put themselves at risk to some degree by condemning Putin. So far, Ukraine has received only $5.4 million of the assets confiscated by the West in response to Russia's annexation of Crimea. Aiming to ease sanctions at a wholesale level is not the way to go, according to Fried. A credible off-ramp, such as denouncing Putin and turning over some assets to Ukraine, ought to be in place for sanctioned individuals, he said. The tycoon would likely be able to access their Western fortunes, opportunities, and assets, which they may wish to leave to their offspring if they took such an offer. Meanwhile, they risk being cast as a traitor and drawing condemnation from the Kremlin. As he considered the idea from the terrace in Italy, Makarov appeared irritated. In order to motivate someone, you have to give them something, and it has to be effective, he stated.